Hi everyone, and welcome to the Tech World Human Skills Podcast. Now, in this episode, we're talking about personas. We're talking about what they are, why they're useful, and how to use them. Now, you know the drill. We've got a brilliant guest with us to help us with the conversation. I first met this person after he just finished speaking on this very subject at the Demo Fest conference in London last year. He's a senior solutions engineer at Confluent. So please welcome to the show, Alex Stuart.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for having me. And looking forward to being able to talk about this today.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Now, I wonder, could you start by introducing yourself to all our lovely listeners?
Sure. So, as you said, currently a senior solutions engineer at Confluent. Kind of the background of getting to there. I was a kind of a comp sci graduate who went into a back office role. Thought back office roles might be where I'd spend my life, but found out that it was just missing a special something. Met someone who worked in pre-sales and then got convinced to come to the dark side and start in pre-sales now, 7 years ago. So now gone from being, one of the youngest pre-sales people in my team to more recently, like helping scale a team at Confluent and now, sitting where I sit.
Brilliant. And so when you say back office, what does back office mean? I always find that interesting. So you're now like front and center helping to sell, working with customers. What did back office mean? What were you doing there?
Yeah, so back in the day, both during a sandwich year in my degree where I was doing some software development for a nuclear power company. And then when I graduated and working on mainframes for a credit bureau, very much involved in the IT operations. So either building the product or part of the product or managing the infrastructure that the product ran on.
Yeah.
I guess for me, front office is someone who's then going out to the wider world and talking about what the product does to people, helping them implement the product. So that's the divide. Everyone helps build the house, but one person gets the name on the sign out the front and the other person's doing all the plumbing inside.
Right, got you. Well, shall we start to talk about personas, which is a really interesting topic, I think. Now, I wonder if we could start off just by thinking about what, for the purpose of this conversation, what we mean by personas. So could you talk us through, what do you mean when you say personas? What is that?
Sure. So whether you're a solution engineer, in pre-sales, whether you're a salesperson, or maybe if you're a back office role, you're a software developer or something like that, there's a need to understand who is going to use your product or the thing that you sell. So you could go out and speak to Chris and Ellie and Sam, but what you'd probably find out is they had very specific needs. So one of the better ways of doing this is abstracting what that person actually looks like. And I think there's a common pattern where people kind of just go purely demographic there. And they say, my persona is a software engineer. My persona is a parent. But there's a bit more complexity to that. It's not just about the demographic. It's about a lot more on top of that. And then from there, once you've figured out personas, it becomes about how can you use those patterns that you'd see across all those individuals to build better products or to build better processes on how you interact with them.
Right, okay. And it's interesting because I think a lot about personas. The way I think about it a lot is often when we're communicating and presenting to people. So I do a lot, when we're presenting at conferences, or trying to influence stakeholders, and you're trying to sort of group together and go, right, well, these have got some characteristics in common, and therefore they care a little bit more about thing A or thing B than perhaps another persona that cares more about thing X and thing Y, for example. So the personas is this idea of grouping together some logical grouping, and you've already started to say, well, it's actually maybe not just job title or something like that, but there's something that groups these people together, and you're going to use those to focus on how you create a product, sell a product, communicate to a stakeholder, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And you've mentioned stakeholder a couple of times. I think a really important part of personas is actually they are really the core tenet of stakeholder management, because you can't figure out who your stakeholders are unless you actually look at what their responsibilities are, what they care about. So if you are multi-threading, if you're talking to multiple people at the same time, then you have to know how to address someone a bit more abstractly than just targeting them, because those personas have relationships amongst themselves as well. And learning how they interact is just as important as knowing what the persona that itself wants.
Okay, so this persona is the idea of somehow grouping together people that we are then going to use to either create a product for, influence, sell to, whatever it might be. So that's kind of what they are. Before we dig into the how and how we do it, and you started to touch on it, but why is it important to think about people in personas?
So I think at least in a product world, a persona represents your ideal customer or your ideal player in your system. And the biggest driver with a product is like you want people to use it or buy it or interact with it. And so when you're looking for how to deal with that ideal customer or those ideal customers, you need to make sure you're not just pitching something like a boom moment. Like it's very easy to really upsell what you're doing, but to get someone to actually continue using something, you kind of want what people might call an aha moment, like when a light bulb goes off in their head. So I think one of the big reasons it can be important is finding those aha moments and making it repeatable. Like once you've figured out personas, you have the opportunity to address in more detail that people have these challenges or people want that positive experience. And if it's consistent, then that's going to make life a lot easier for you because you're addressing that time after time after time.
Okay, so rather than just crafting something customized for one particular person, Deepak or Billy or whoever it is, you're actually going, right, we can now make this consistent and repeatable, which means we can scale this and have a greater impact with it.
Yeah, and lean into your empathy. Like pre-sales, I tend to say, is a mix of empathy and expertise. People want a product specialist, but it's also part of a sales cycle. So people want to feel like the person who's selling to them cares about what they're doing. Like that empathy requires being able to put on that person's shoes. And again, knowing what that person's shoes should look like is a really good way of building out the empathy and sympathy faster.
Okay. So we thought what they are. We thought why they can be useful. Should we start to dig into the how? And I guess I'll hand over to you at this point. How is it you go about doing this so that I guess it makes you be more successful? So how is it you do it?
Sure. So, I mentioned earlier, I tend to see that most people start with personas as demographic.
Okay.
So if you were doing like B2C sort of direct to consumer products, you may quite literally be going for a demographic. Men 25 to 35. Great. Okay. Alex might buy my shoes.
Okay.
But you want to find why Alex wants to buy my shoes. And that starts to become psychographic. So when we talk about psychographic measures, that's kind of the qualitative, but quite consistent pains or interests or values that person has. So if you think about maybe selling to a manager in IT, their pains could be they're very busy, they have a big team, they have to, chase both pressure from the bottom and pressure from the top coming in. Their interests might be having a use case or like getting better value out of their headcount. And what do they value? Well, maybe they value innovation, maybe they value efficiency. These are, they're subjective, but they're quite consistent to measure. They're a fairly tangible emotional sort of barrier. And then obviously those kind of psychographical checkpoints tend to lead to behavioral checkpoints as well. So someone like a manager is probably going to have a preference for something that allows them to check on their team. So they're going to have like those behavioral preferences based on their persona's kind of role. If you are selling, you may be looking at buying behavior. If you're designing, you might be looking at interactive behavior. You can begin to look at what patterns of activity. And then I would say the final core component is relational. So again, I've touched on this a little earlier. You begin to look at, what does this persona do with my other personas? Again, when people just build personas demographically, they tend to say a designer or a software engineer does X, Y, and Z. But actually, I probably want to look a bit more widely and say, well, X publishes the product or sets it to live, and then another person comes along and interacts with it off that behavior. So how many times is this persona going to be upset that they can't use our product because this other persona hasn't used it fast enough? Or again, if you're in the buying cycle, this might be, this person is an influencer. They will go and champion our product in the business. This person is an economic buyer. They're the one with the actual money, but they're going to turn to that influencer to figure out if this product's worth buying. So once you have those extra dimensions, you suddenly have a much richer understanding of sort of why someone will do something. And it's about measuring those whats, basically, from your existing audience and from your own perception, to build out a better view of what that persona and those personas sort of do as a whole.
Okay, so you've got this idea of a persona. So if I just play this back to you to make sure that I've got this in my mind. So we've got this, let's say the persona I think you used was an IT manager. So you've got somebody that's an IT manager, and you're moving away from a demographic based, which is, this might be a man in his 30s to 40s or whatever that might be. You're actually saying, right, we need to think about what pain this particular type of role is feeling, what success looks like for them, and their values. And what were the different things you said? I think there was a value based bit you were putting on there.
Psychographical. That's kind of like, how do they think? What do they, what hurts or what feels good, and what do they value? Behavioral. So based on how they feel about those things, what experiences do they tend to have? And then relational, which the manager's the easy one. We know that managers report up and have people beneath them. That could be, are they influencers? Are they detractors? Are they in sales, like a buyer? Like, how do they fit into the relationship with the other personas?
So psychographical. We won't just say they're psychos, right? Psychographical, behavioural, and then relationship being the three sort of. So do you then say, okay, how do you label those? Like, do you call them like IT manager, or what's the sort of, how do you sort of name, and therefore do you have like 7 different IT managers that have all got different sort of attributes on those 3 different, the psycho, the behavioral, and the relationship? How many personas have you got? Have you got millions, and how does it all work?
So it's an interesting comparison between the field facing side, where I potentially speak to dozens of companies, and I'm pretty sure we've all been here. Like, you get promoted, but you don't really get promoted, so your job title is just some new made up thing. So it's quite hard going into market and being like, again, this is the demographic problem. If I was just looking for an IT manager, then this person who's called head of IT and this person who's called lead IT engineer, they're all responsible for people. They all have the same pain. They all have the same values. They report to roughly the same people. So that's where having those pillars is so important, that actually it's not about looking for an IT manager. It's who fits this persona, who fits this like personality type that I'm looking to address. And I tend to see in the like product management and software engineering world, they're quite focused on having the actual title. In our more field world, it becomes a lot more about finding the person who matches that profile, like sitting around a table and realizing that the person sat opposite you looks like they're a leader, looks like they fit that idea of what you're looking for, and the person sat next to them maybe fits into a different persona. And then as you go through a development cycle or a deployment cycle or a purchasing cycle, that's also where it becomes a bit more important to not be super set on having them fit into the right profile, because you'll find you have to interact with different people at different stages in slightly different ways. So to use the example, given you mentioned Demo Fest, a software demo to an executive, it's going to be very different than a software demo to, an engineer who actually uses the product every day. And there's nuances in the pace at which you communicate that, in when you communicate it, on how focused you are on different levels of the product. So again, it begins to be about mapping out those relationships over time as much as, between each other.
So so it's quite interesting. We've sort of been talking about empathy a little bit at the beginning, and then talking about this personas. So regardless of whether you're in sales or product development or whatever it might be, quite often you might want to talk to these people in these personas to understand their perspective, which means you can build a better product. You can sell to them more effectively. You can understand the challenges they have and be more successful. Now, if you're going to LinkedIn and typing in IT manager, right, you're going to get 100 hits back. It's really easy to then say, oh, I'd like to talk to all of these people. But if you've got, this sort of detailed persona that you're talking about, how do you find people that match that persona so that you can speak to them to understand their perspective?
So like most muscles, you have to train it. You can't just, you can't weightlift twice your body weight the first time you go to the gym. So one of the patterns there, I would say, with LinkedIn is, once you know some of those psychographical points, for example, people who maybe in their descriptions of their current role are talking about managing a team of 7 people, talking about the time they pushed a major rollout, talking about this certification and that certification. Just because the job title isn't the same, because you've mapped that persona, because you've figured out why they care about something, it's actually a lot easier then to go find, you mentioned this, and I'm going to reach out, I'm going to have a chat with you to see if you actually fit this profile. Maybe you're an edge persona, you're a third example compared to my A and B. And then that's another opportunity to figure out, what does the edge of this look like? What's someone who I hadn't even imagined when I imagined my personas, they may actually start to appear. So yes, look for those core job titles. I think if you're lucky enough to be in the field, speak to everyone in the business and see how they interact with each other and build out that map. Anyone who's interested is interested for a reason.
Mm.
So they're still worth having some degree of communication with. And then after that, it becomes iterative. You're going to go out, you're going to test your idea of a persona, you're going to probably occasionally fail. Failure is fine as long as you learn from it. So then you can build out further with that persona that actually, I should be addressing them differently, I should be putting more pressure on their values than on their pains. You can build out a better approach by improving over time.
And does this idea of personas ever be a bit reductive? So I guess what I mean by that is, you're speaking to an individual that has got a very specific nature, a very specific nurture, a very specific job title, and you are then applying the persona of somebody different or a group of people that are different to that person. Does it reduce them as an individual to being this persona and therefore make you less accurate and less able to talk to this person effectively because you're making assumptions or statements that perhaps aren't true to this individual?
But my belief there would be, you shouldn't be reading from a script. There's 2 ways of looking at it from your point of view. If you were a product developer, if you were sitting behind the curtain and building something, there is a risk that if you never interact with that customer, you may actually end up building something off a perceived person versus a non-perceived person.
Yeah.
Whereas it's a lot nicer in the field, because the reality is I go into a meeting knowing I should be talking to this kind of person in this kind of way.
Yeah.
But actually, it's a starting point. It's not the end point.
Yeah.
In the pre-sales role, it's quite a lot of context switching. Sometimes I'm a seller, sometimes I'm a techie, sometimes I'm something in the middle. So for me, the persona is a good way of finding the new context and then being able to go and address and speak to that person as a real human being, not as a persona. And I think as well, when that relationship path I was talking about before as well, that's also where it's useful. you could go in and you could address everyone as an individual, but if you don't have a map in your head of how they should be interacting with one another, it'd be very difficult to then go in and like relearn this every single time. So it's a shortcut. It's not a rule book.
Yeah, the analogy when I was thinking about this that sort of came to my mind was a bit of a golf analogy. I'm not very good at golf, but this just sort of seemed to pop into my mind. It's like the persona doesn't give you a hole in one, but it gets you on the green. It gets you in the right sort of area. If you didn't have a persona and you had no ID and you were entirely irrelevant, it's like you're off in the rough somewhere. You know, you've missed the fairway, you're off in the woods somewhere. Whereas the persona perhaps gets you to the green, gets you close enough. And then it's all those things that you talked about, exercising curiosity, discovering the individual, getting into that, which is going to get you the putt. But it's sort of got you pretty close, and a lot closer than you would be if you hadn't done any of this kind of preparation and thinking in advance.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone who's watching this as the video rather than just listening may notice a few pairs of running trainers keep appearing behind me.
Right.
I'd use a very similar metaphor. You're going to go out and you're going to buy a race shoe for race day, and you're going to buy a comfortable trainer for recovery runs. They're your personas. Like, the value of that trainer is it doesn't hurt my muscles or it makes me run faster. You cannot buy a race shoe and then immediately run a 2-hour, 15-minute marathon. It requires years of training. It requires being ready for that specific race and those conditions. But it's going to be a lot easier if you're in a fast carbon-plated shoe versus, turning up in a soft shoe that's just comfortable for jogging about. The persona's there to be an aid to what you're trying to do. It's not there to, get you the hole in one, as you said.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've learned something else there. I thought I was doing pretty well just by having a pairing of running shoes, let alone a pair of high performance running shoes and recovery running shoes. I didn't look at that. He's just pointed for those. I thought running shoes were running shoes. Recovery? Right. Anyway, that's a whole new world. Maybe for a whole different podcast. But you learn every day's a school day, as they say.
Exactly.
Any other tips and any other things that you want to share with us about how you bring personas to life and help you be really successful?
So one of the things that stood out to me, and I've talked about when I've been presenting about this quite often, is there's always a risk that people create personas in isolation. I actually don't think in my career I've done a particularly good job of talking about personas with the software engineering side of the business compared to my own personas. And that's something I'd like to improve over time.
Okay.
Because chances are your marketing team have marketing personas, your product development team probably have product personas, their ideal user, your sales and pre-sales and maybe even your post-sales team all have their personas they act to as well. So an important part is just kind of comparing what everyone is doing and making sure everyone is aligned. There's no point building a product that you pitch to this ideal customer, and then when you're speaking to customers, you're pitching to someone completely different.
Yeah.
So you can, if you're good at note-taking and they're good at note-taking, actually building out those profiles together can be super useful. Don't just make it your feedback cycle, make it everyone's feedback cycle. And then that's where, maybe touching on your earlier point, how reductive is this? That's where we can start to sort of build those Venn diagrams. Where does everyone begin to come together? What are the common pain points or the common values? What does the top level persona look like? And then to the points I've mentioned before, I think people should then try and map these out. Again, if you're just looking at the micro and you're looking at this specific pain or this specific step that they do, that can sort of hyper focus, and that's not what personas are about. So instead, you should be looking at sort of where they matter and why they matter, going through a normal product lifecycle or a normal usage pattern, whatever your framing reference is, because that's going to add some flesh to what their relationships are, why they may have that specific pain, and so on. And then just go out and test it. I said before, it's okay to fail in the like using personas, but it's by its very nature, it's emotional. You should be sort of using this with people. Otherwise, they're not really personas. They're just robots that you've made up with job titles.
Yeah.
So yeah, begin to
I
test
love
it,
that
basically.
idea of the Venn diagram, because so often you think, right, there are these product, we are designing our product for these people, and then there's a disconnect then between when you're in the field talking to those people and they're going, well, I don't want that product. I want the product that does this. But the people that are creating the product say, well, we're creating a product that's doing this. And so that Venn diagram, right, these are the personas. And then I guess that constant communication, constant feedback from the field into the product development, into the marketing, into the sales, back into the product development, into the marketing, that constant communication. So important and so often very difficult to do, particularly in larger organizations.
Yeah, I mean, to make another shoe metaphor, or parable, like a good example of that in a product organization, one of the big running shoe brands, they make super comfortable running shoes. They found out that a lot of their customer base was medical staff who are on their feet all day, need that cushioning, need that comfort.
Yeah.
If they weren't interacting with those personas who buy their shoes, they would carry on building really good running shoes.
Yeah.
But that would only be runners. They'd have all of this other market missing because they haven't been iterative, they haven't been improving. Now they can fork out those product lines and have a more comfortable working shoe and their running shoes, rather than isolating one of their sort of core audiences. And I think that's a very important part of it. It should be based on external feedback. It should be based on internal feedback.
Yeah.
But it should always be evolving.
Yeah.
If they're static, then they're probably not good personas, because humans evolve as well. Like, humans change over time. So you should be changing your perception of those humans as well.
Brilliant. Now, I'm glancing at the clock. We're almost at time. But before we wrap up, one of the bits that you talked about was the relationship side of the persona, and I guess understanding the relationships in when you're talking to an external organisation. Have you got any tips on how you build that? I guess that stakeholder map, that relationship map, so that you understand who's the movers, the shakers. I think you said economic buyers and influencers, but how you understand how that relationship map comes together at a persona level.
Sure. So I think a common pattern people will do here is like hierarchy maps.
Okay.
You know that this is the business leader and these people report to them, and here's the operative level. And then it's quite common to then fill this in with like traffic lights. So this person's additive, this person is not additive, and this person's amber. We don't know what they are in the moment, but we can see them this way. One thing I've liked doing, I've talked about life cycles and processes quite a few times on this podcast. I have a graph that I draw where it's like what and who, where the what is at a column level. It's sort of the stages of what I expect in that cycle. So in a sales cycle, that could be demand generation leads to deal qualification, leads to solution definition, which leads to designing/implementing the solution, which leads to a sale.
Okay.
And then the post-sale side. Inside of that, there's tasks. So that might be a demonstration. It might be filling out an RFP or a security questionnaire. It might be handing over paperwork or talking to legal. And then you can have, on that what level with those tasks, you can then beneath it put who are the who's. So I can see then across that life cycle that I probably interact quite heavily with the operators, the day-to-day like task-based roles across the middle of the deal. They are the people who maybe work in cybersecurity, so I need to fill in the security questionnaire for. They are the people who are going to be using it day-to-day, so we need to do some training with them. But I'm probably bookended by an executive, because the executive has the business goal that they share with us during the qualification stage.
Yeah.
And then they are the ones who buy the product at the end. But in the middle, they want to be hands off. So knowing maybe the operators are busy, so they don't want to prioritize us, but we know that the executive does have a high priority to get this live as quickly as possible. understanding that what and when, and then comparing it to the who's, means you can begin to change the influence. Make sure that the movers are moving and that the shakers are shaking at the right times, because it is complex. It's like having a family. Not everyone wants to do the same thing at the same time. So when you have a better understanding that your dad wants to relax on Sunday, but your grandchildren or whatever want to go and play in the park, well, that's where you begin to find the balance. Who deserves what at what time, and how can we make sure everyone interacts correctly with one another.
Love it. So this idea, and if I just play it back, because I think I understood it, you've got, from there is nothing to there is a product that is live and giving value to people that is being used. You break that into phases, sort of almost like the chronological phases that you're going to go through. And then from that, you then break that into, right, well, what things need to happen at each of those chronological phases. And then you allocate personas to each of those tasks. And then you're able to say, right, so these are all the personas, these are what, and now we can define those personas using those methods that we talked about, and then what we need to do with each of those personas to influence them and make sure that they're happy and getting what they need.
Yeah, and see where they cluster together. I've got a graphic of it up for myself at the moment, just as a talking point to help me. And I'm just realizing when I've done this, like the executive always seems to be not in the same group as the specialist until the deal closes, because the specialist helps the operators, and maybe the specialist is the one who comes to us first.
Right.
But the executive trusts them. They're the specialists. The executive doesn't need to be on the same call or in the same meetings as that specialist potentially until we're agreeing that everything's good. Just as a given example, but I think that's where you can start to see a more abstract layer of it all when you've had the opportunity to map this out and understand those relationships.
Yeah. Love it. Well, I'm just looking at the clock, and I think sadly we have run out of time. It's been a brilliant conversation. I wonder, could you perhaps just sort of maybe summarise or your key takeaways for people that are driving, listening to this in the gym, and just want to try and lodge stuff in their brain? How would you summarise what you've said?
So my kind of, I guess, closing statements on this is often it's subjective, and I'm kind of asking you to come up with an objective way of measuring subjective pieces.
Yeah.
So the quick learning is, in that case, it's okay. You should be iterating. You should be taking the opportunity to find out who the people are who use whatever it is you work with. So go out, be bold, test this. If you are using it, if you already use it, go back and review what you've done before, let it evolve. Because regardless of what role you're in, the customer is important. And this is one of the quickest ways of finding out who your customer is. And if you can provide an enhanced customer experience, then you'll be building more success for your customer, you'll be building more success for yourself. And those three pillars I talked about before, the psychometric, the behavioral, and the relationship, they're great starting points for then finding out more about those people as well.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think for me, as I just sort of reflect on what you're saying there and reflect on the conversation, it's this idea that personas are there to help you get consistency, scalability, and to help you get closer to where you need to be quicker. And I love the way you were talking about, right, so think about those personas, not just in demographs, but thinking about their value, their pain, their the psychological side of them, then their behaviours, and then also their relationship. And then I also quite like then the structural bit we were doing at the end of saying, right, well, let's just walk through an example of how this works and map it out. Again, not because we want to be overly reductive and we can't apply, we're trying to make the subjective objective, but we're trying to do the best we can and be as prepped as we can. And if we've got that great foundation, then when you're face to face with people, you can, of course, exercise curiosity, you can riff, you can improvise, you can do what you need to do, but you've done all that prep work before, so you've got a great foundation to be really relevant and really compelling to individuals. Love it. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Much appreciated. If people have loved this topic, and would love to get in touch and find out more. How could people get in touch with you, Alex?
Yeah, so if you want to talk to me about this, I love talking about it. You can find me on LinkedIn. So my /in is AJF Stuart, or just look for Alex Stuart. At Confluent, I think there's only one of me.
Right.
And you'll find me there. Always happy to chat with people on LinkedIn. Or meet me at a conference. I tend to bumble around quite a few, so if you do ever see me, come say hi. We'll grab a coffee and talk about this till the cows come home.
Brilliant. Well, I'll put a link to LinkedIn in the show notes, so if people want to find it there, if that's easier for them. So I guess just the last thing to say is thank you so much, Alex. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a brilliant conversation, and it's been lovely chatting to you.
No, likewise. Thank you so much for having me.